Welcome to the smartest people in the room. We are glad you are here, and just by showing up, you're already demonstrating your very own smarts. Today, I am pleased to present two experts in the area of streaming fraud. And with the increasing proliferation of AI and music, this topic is going to continue to impact the business in several ways, and we will explore those in just a few moments. I promise you will leave here today smarter and more enlightened than you arrived. Before we get started, please let me take care of some business. First, to the audience, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat window. The reason we do these webinars is twofold. First, we want to showcase really smart people and the amazing work they do day to day in the music industry. The second reason is a bit more nuanced. Many of you know that I am a music industry headhunter. I run the music practice at Turnkey ZRG, and I place music executives in roles throughout the industry. So by definition and function, I help people connect with companies. In this series, my goal is to help you make more connections, and I invite you to take full advantage of that opportunity. Specifically, I invite you to engage with the speakers and the other attendees in the chat of the Zoom. Please introduce yourselves, share your LinkedIn profile, say hello to your friends, and make some new ones. And ask questions of our speakers. We will try to address as many of those as possible during the session. And also, this is very important, not only to the speakers, but also to the audience. Please make sure your chat is set to address everyone, not just the host and speakers. I want to thank our program sponsors, for without their support, we could not keep this free. Special thanks to MedJet, Turnkey ZRG, the Tennessee Entertainment Commission, Tennessee Brew Works, and Better Than Booze. So let's get down to business. Today, we welcome Steve Ganis. He's a partner at Mintz, a national law firm, and has decades of experience as a leading lawyer in financial services regulation and financial crimes prevention. He advises the DOJ in criminal and regulatory investigations and enforcement, banking, securities and derivatives regulation, fintech and crypto launches and compliance, financial sector M&A financings, and investment fund formation and transactions. Steve has presented widely on fraud prevention and anti-money laundering and lessons from financial services for the music industry digital streaming ecosystem, including at Trust and Safety in Music in 2024 and 2025. Music Biz 2024 and 25 as well, and co-created and moderated a talk called Streaming Fraud and How It Works, Who It Hurts, and What the Industry Can Do, a symposium at New York Music Month 2025. He's been quoted widely in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other media. Before Mintz, he worked at Fidelity Investments as Chief Anti-Money Laundering and U.S. Sanctions Officer. That's a mouthful. Serving while at Fidelity and the U.S. Treasury Department's Bank Secrecy Act Advisory Group as counsel to the U.S. House of Representatives Banking and Financial Services Committee and the Securities and Exchange Commission's General Counsel Office. He graduated from Harvard Law School with a JD and Dartmouth College with a AB summa cum laude. He's obviously one of the smartest guys in this room for sure. And joining him today is Stephen Frank. He is compliance, fraud, prevention, and anti-money laundering and identity verification expert with nearly 2 decades of experience building products and strategies that utilize identity and risk mitigation, personalization, and customization. Over the last 3 years, he's brought his foundation from the highly regulated industries of global financial services and aerospace and defense to the music industry, advising on the fight against fraud, intellectual property violations, and the anonymous consumption, where he led SiriusXM and Pandora's fight to detect and prevent on-product fraud and to streamline fraud prevention across the enterprise. Today, along with his music consulting in the music industry with BeatApp and Music Fights Fraud Alliance, Stephen's work extends to fine art, antiquities, luxury, e-commerce, esports, ticketing, and content creation, content consumption, advertising, fintech, and auctions. That's a mouthful as well. You guys are going to be incredible on this today. It's such an honor to welcome you two rock stars to our platform. Please take it away, boys.
Hey, thanks so much, Tom. I really appreciate it. And just wanted to thank you also for this series. As we may touch on, I came from financial services and still am in financial services. That's still sort of my main gig, but I started getting involved in the music industry fraud stuff in 2023, thanks in significant part to Steve Frank. But getting up, you know, to do what I do, you have to get up to speed on the industry, and there's no better way than watching your smartest people in the room series. And I've learned so much from the wonderful people that you've had, and I think it's a great service that you do as a labor of love, even beyond your work that you talked about. So thank you for all that. Steve Frank, you and I have known each other for a pretty long time, probably over 10 years now. Your background, as Tom was just talking about, has all these different industries. Uh, you've had a consistent focus on fraud prevention, compliance, money laundering, but you've been in defense, arts and antiquities. You were in financial services when I first met you, so you've seen a lot of these different places, a lot of these different industries. Uh, today's hot topic, or today's hot topic that we're going to be talking about for music industry, and one that gets a lot of coverage in music industry, is fraud. Fraud is sort of an unhappy topic, and music is a wonderful, happy thing to me. So, why do you think that fraud is becoming such a focus in all the various industry forums where people in the business get together and talk about what's going on?
Well, first, thanks for having us, Tom, as well. And Steve, thanks for being here. So ultimately, I think that fraud is still a huge topic because it's growing. There's over $1 billion in fraud estimated in just streaming fraud alone. And to think about all the other vectors of fraud throughout the music industry, there's a lot of opportunity for fraudsters to take advantage of systems, take advantage of controls, steal data, as well as just steal from the general prima facie sort of stealing. So, thinking about all those vectors, there's a lot of opportunity. Therefore, there's going to be a lot of fraud.
Yeah. Well, and Tom mentioned a topic that's not just in all the music industry discussions that I go to and am part of, but also financial services and tech, two other worlds that I spend a lot of time in, and that's AI. It seems like you can't go anywhere without talking about that, but it is very significant for the topic that we're talking about today. Um, to me, AI has a couple of different aspects of relevance for music fraud. The bad guys can use it to simplify, and the good guys can use it. And I think that that's going to change a lot of things. But you're much closer to the operational realities on the ground. How do you think AI is affecting both the threats that you help people address and the tools to address them?
Well, there's two ways of thinking about it in terms of the streaming environment. So, on the creator side, it's about getting better detection tools, better footprinting tools, and ultimately the industry catching up to itself to develop a better footprinting system, a more uniform footprinting system, a smarter footprinting system that allows for AI detection and also AI footprinting so that we can actually detect, is the creator the source, the authentic source of the content. On the consumption side, it's about better mapping tools, better identity tools, becoming more proactive in using machine learning to detect and scale. And then when you're detecting these patterns, being able to pull these levers easily so that you can then scale your systems across millions of users at a rather rapid pace, ensuring that you're staying up to date with what's detected as anomalous, and then going even further to gather feedback from users to then say, okay, is this just an anomalous user that happens to be a good authentic user using my platform anomalously, in which case I'm not going to want to throw controls at them. I'm going to want to let them through this filtration system, as opposed to someone who's a bad actor or a bot, and therefore we are going to want to throw a control at them that actually does block the activity.
That's interesting. I know you were at a broker dealer, and I've worked a lot with the banking and broker dealers on detecting suspicious activity. One of the big problems is false positives, and you were just talking about that. So a lot of people from the industry here, well, gee, we're going to start detecting people, spending money investigating them, shutting down accounts and things like that. How do we make sure that we're not getting innocent people swept up into this and spending money monitoring people who, um, you know, may have something that somebody considers as a red flag, but is really innocent. How do you really get down to that level of analysis to manage the volumes if you were to DSP, but also distros are now getting into the monitoring business, other parts of the music industry. How do you look at false positives and the the balance that has to be struck there?
Well, first, it's about the growth and the progress of your immature fraud prevention programs to becoming a more mature fraud prevention program, and that's the difference from having the binary decisions of what I'm seeing fraud or not, to what's the risk behind the activity that I'm seeing. Okay, and it's about mapping this all into what becomes a living identity profile for your users, be it on the creator side or the consumption side of your platform. So ultimately, you're using what it becomes a proactive, active, and reactive holistic program that is an identification program, a monitoring and supervision program, and then a reporting program that builds in living risk profiles for your creators as well as your consumers, and then maps that activity across the entire use of your platform.
Fascinating. Wonder if we could take a step back. I've been to a lot of these things where people have discussed this topic. You're obviously involved in it every day. Uh, when people talk about fraud in music, they often are even referring to different phenomenon. So I want to take a moment and see if we can break down some of the different categories that we're talking about fraudulent activity that's out there. Um, there can be fraudulent streaming that you and I have talked about a lot.
Mhm.
Um, and there can also be fraudulent content that people have created through fraud. There can be people claiming rights that they don't have. There can be even fraud in ancillary areas like concert tickets, merchandise, things like that. So when you look at the music industry fraud, I think you use the word holistically. Like how does a company that, for example, supports artists and helps them get out there, get streamed, helps them market and things like that. How do they address all these different types of fraud? It seems like there's a lot going on, and it's hard. It's hard to focus the effort. So, how do they think about the tools that they need, the resources that they need, the governance, the controls?
Well, first off, it's about assessing the risk of your business model, understanding what you're doing. So, what I was seeing pretty frequently was consumption fraud. Okay. So, from my perspective,
And what do you mean by that? Just to make sure we're all on the same on the same wavelength. What do you mean by consumption fraud? Just be very clearly examples.
consumption of content through a streaming platform, Pandora. So,
Okay.
what I was seeing pretty consistently was users consuming anomalously. Okay. And
Would
streaming.
that be like with a bot farm or something like that? Or
Absolutely, yes. That is one example of it. So, streaming up specific content to either alter royalty pools or alter charting results. Okay. So, thinking about that environment, it's about assessing where your opportunities are to game the system. And then from that point, consistently assessing how you can proactively identify certain patterns within your structure or identify those users, and then actively monitor their activity throughout their entire journey on your product or service, and then going a step further and retroactively dealing with reporting, investigation, and potentially putting in corrective actions. At that point, you may discover that a need for potentially further feedback or whatever the instance may be, aggregating further data into mapping systems to assess patterns. And this is where you were going, I believe, with the what can we use to detect fraud in terms of AI and machine learning. It's at this point that you can begin to assess what tools are necessary and how you can scale to better assess where your anomalies are within your patterns.
And where do you think the industry is today on that? I mean, there's always a race. The bad guys are using new technologies and they're discovering what's being used to detect them and evading it. And then the industry is catching up and trying to find new technology to catch the new technology. So there's always a race. And we've seen that in financial fraud for decades, really. For the 25 years that I've been looking at it, and even longer, where the fraudsters are always one step ahead in some cases. But how do you think the industry is doing in terms of using the promise of AI in practical terms to cut down on the fraud?
So I think that we're still at our infancy. We're still at our infancy because we're still using signals from fraudsters to detect directly where patterns of fraud are occurring on the creator side oftentimes. And so I think that we're still in our infancy in that we could be getting smarter on the creator side as well as on the consumption side. And you are seeing a lot of efforts being put into safer footprinting, smarter footprinting, understanding what's behind the content itself. But there's also a lot of efforts that still need to be made in terms of understanding how we can identify and authenticate the actual source of the content.
So you mentioned one of the things, a, a lot of people have an understanding that there's artist royalty money or labels money, rights owners money being taken. Um, with the unique way that our streaming ecosystem works and divides up money and the flow of funds and things like that. Um, you also mentioned in a couple of answers ago, you talked about charting and charts and stuff like that. I see our friend from Billboard, Kevin Rutherford, has joined us. Hi, Kevin. But I and he's spoken eloquently with us on some of those things. But talk a little bit about, because I find it fascinating how fraud can relate to charting and that aspect, and how people make money. Why would anybody try to game the charts?
So understanding that there's the whole ecosystem behind, potentially getting further radio plays from being higher in the charts, getting more accolades, getting easier to get contracts when you're higher up on the popularity chain. So absolutely easier opportunity for the fraudster at that point to then gather further. Also, if you're talking about a business behind the system, if I could show growth for someone who I'm actually gaming the system for, then I can show a track record of success the way I can in financial services, the way I can in defense, the way I can in any industry that I'm committing fraud or money laundering. So with that, I can further game the system by gaining more contracts.
One of the interesting things in both the charting fraud and just general streaming for royalties, what you called consumption fraud, sometimes this is done, uh, with fake content and things like that. Sometimes it's done with the content of legitimate artists who are using vendors to for promotion, for marketing, and things like that. And unbeknownst to them, the uh, fraudulent methods are being used, which might be the charting side, might be bots, might be even account intrusion, and as part of an illicit marketing strategy by these bad vendors, bad Apple vendors that are out there. How do you how did you look when you were at Pandora, Sirius, and XM, and how do you think DSPs and people are looking at whether it's a bad business that's promoting a good artist, or whether it's a bad artist or bad or fake artist or things like that? Um, how do you find these like nodes of marketing malfeasance and focus on those?
So this is where you need that holistic program. And this is where you need those living profiles in order to map common characteristics between the account holders as well as common activity across your platform. Once you have that mapping, it's a lot easier to see where these anomalies are coming from and what characteristics are mapped together. Now the technologies do exist in fraud prevention to see to unmask VPNs to understand who's actually behind a certain activity. So it is absolutely easy to detect once you have the systems in place. But it's about having the systems in place, developing a culture that allows for that holistic activity and that mapping to occur.
But how do you have a system, just to press on that a little bit in concrete terms, how do you build a system to find a bad marketing operation when you have all this other data that's like one step removed from the marketing operation, which is really where the red flags occur? How do you link that? How do you analyze that? And how do you build, enrich the data to connect it to businesses?
Sure. So I used to say we're trying to always answer a couple of questions about our users. Those questions are you a bot or are you human? Are you who you claim to be? Do you remain who you claim to be? Are you using our platform in accordance with our terms of service, but also the way we think a human would be using it in a normal case? And then, do you continue use with that pattern across the life cycle of your account? Once that's determined, we can then consistently map who you are with commonalities across our platform use. If we see enough common threads, we can alert our systems to say, hey, let's take a look at this and say, all right, what are these patterns? What's going on here? Maybe throw further obstacles in that user's path so that we can detect friction or whatnot. But ultimately, it's about gathering enough data to then put into a system that we can then use our machine learning to map together and then alert us to other anomalies that are occurring within our platform. If that's done correctly, it could potentially even be used for personalization and customization if you hide enough of the data, in accordance with use.
So increasingly, when people talk about fraud in music industry, another concept starts rearing its ugly head, which is money laundering, and AML. Which again, in financial services, I think everybody is internalized, but I think in music, it's still new to some people. It's anti-money laundering. I always try to put the anti in there because it sounds better when I say I've been involved in anti-money laundering since the 90s than to say it when I've been involved in money laundering since then. So the anti is key. Um, but what is money laundering? I mean, most people's understanding, shaped heavily by the movies, is that money laundering is about the mafia. Money laundering is about drug cartels. Money laundering is about um, human trafficking and arms trafficking and maybe terrorist financing. What does money laundering have to do with music?
So, as we've seen recently, there is a case ongoing with the Michael Smith case, whereby an individual was able to add content and then consume that content fraudulently with a number of accounts, funneling those funds that he was making through royalties back through the accounts on the streaming platform of choice. Ultimately, that money was also funneled through banking systems, which shot up red flags. This was an interesting case and a case that probably isn't going to be the norm that we're going to see, but it because of its visibility and the size being $10 million, it has spurred the industry to a lot of action. And I think the discussions that the industry has had, particularly led by Portia Sabin at the beginning and now Michael Lewan, are really adding a lot of effort and transparency into what was, a very gray industry and an industry that was seemingly in the dark for a long time. You know,
So
now
let's talk a little bit about. I know most people know who Portia and Michael Luan are. Portia Sabin and Michael Luan, and Music Fights Fraud Alliance. But you're involved in that. Why don't you just say a few words about that so that folks know what's going on?
Yeah, so Portia and Michael have done a great job leading a lot of efforts, gaining transparency and adding to the identification, detection, and mitigation of a lot of the fraudulent activity that we saw. And they're leading a lot of the efforts in terms of creating what will hopefully become, a quasi self-regulatory organization that we're used to seeing in a financial services world, that's going to mandate, membership, certain reporting, and the upholding of certain standards across the board, so that really we're trying to reach that uniformity so that we can then get to a point where we can identify behavior as ultimately good or bad, or risky or less risky. And that's depending on, which how mature your systems are.
Right. Right. Um, Back to the money laundering, just because I can't help myself.
Oh,
uh,
yeah. Let me ask you, can you tell us how ultimately you see money laundering working in the music industry more in any other cases, or could you tell us how ultimately your background as an anti-money laundering expert in large and complex cases and industry participants like Fidelity has assisted in your conversations here?
um, yeah, thank you for that question. So, first of all, how does laundering relate to this? Well, the federal crime of money laundering is basically taking money from a list of certain crimes and taking the money that's made from those crimes and effectively moving it, having transactions that involve the fruits of those kind of crimes. And fraud is one of those crimes. And wire fraud, is technically the crime that people commit when they are doing music industry fraud, typically, the federal wire fraud statute. So if you commit federal wire fraud and you move the money to hide it, or you have any transaction to basically conceal, uh, and I'm putting this in plain English rather than talking about how the statute talks about it, but if the purpose of moving the money is to distance uh, the money from its bad origin, to clean it up, to launder it, that's the nature of the crime. And there are certain elements to the crime and things like that. There's interestingly another side to the money laundering crime, which is moving money to promote the crime. So if I move money to hide the fact that I am, for example, financing a bot farm and the operations of a bot farm, that can be what they call promote money laundering, because I'm promoting wire fraud by moving the money and in order to promote wire fraud. So that's what money laundering has to do most immediately. As long as there's fraud and there's money moving around, and there very often is money moving around, because ever since the Music Modernization Act and even before that, there's a lot of different intermediaries in the funds flow of the royalty funds, and a lot of different kinds of payments and royalties that happen with music. And a lot of the people who are watching this know more about that than I do. But there are the MLC is now interspersed and things like that. So when you have to hide things from intermediaries and stuff like that, that often triggers the crime of money laundering, or satisfies all the elements. Then another aspect is, you can use, because there's so much money in music, you can use uh, content and fraudulent streaming and things like that to actually launder proceeds of other types of crimes, like uh, arms trafficking and drug trafficking in Scandinavia. Um, in Sweden, there was a big case where there were gangs that were making money, and they would take their street cash and use them to buy rights to people's music, and then fraudulently stream that music in order to make it look like they were making money from owning rights, from being a rights owner, when in fact they were making money from criminal activity. So any place there's a lot of money that moves, there's all the other actual violent crimes, drug crimes, and things like that around the world, where people will look for a less scrutinized
How,
area.
but in an unregulated industry like the music industry, and
Mhm.
that we don't report, our consumer numbers, our consumption numbers. There's no threshold for entry really that's mandated across our industry at this point, and unfortunately, Michael and James Pollock on the call as well, at the RIAA, and their counterparts across the world at the IFPI, and all these other groups, they only have so much power to help out here and do things. How exactly does it work? How do these cases come to light really in an unregulated world?
Well, it's fun. It's funny. One of the things that I said the first time you and I spoke on this, which was back in early 2024, um, at Porsche's Trust and Safety conference that she had in New York. Um, one of the things that I was talking about was that somebody would bring a case because there is fraud and there is money laundering going on, and whenever you get into millions of dollars, a federal prosecutor is going to potentially be interested, and that actually did happen with the Michael Smith case that you talked about. And our friend Kate Riley, who's now a prior Cashman, brought that case in the federal government, uh, and I think that that's a good example. I think people in the music industry are increasingly wanting to report fraud to the government directly. And I think people who are using tools, using fraud detection tools, and I know you work with some of the people who do that, and you were mentioning some of the names of those tools, but like BDAP, for example, things like that. People look at those things and the output, and then they investigate. And then when they get close to finding, hey, here's a whole bunch of accounts that are linked to or activity, a whole bunch of streams that are linked to each other and potentially reflective of bad guy. At some point, there's an analysis of whether to bring it to the government's attention. Now, why do people do that? Well, I think nobody wants the industry to be tarred with a lot of crime going on, and a lot of fraud and dirty money going through it. So that's reputationally, I think it's important. But you mentioned that the industry is unregulated. One of the things that I said at that January 2024 thing, and I've said since then at different times, is that because of the possibility of prosecution, then it was only a possibility before the Michael Smith case.
Correct.
Because of that possibility, there is regulation. It is a shadow type of regulation. It's a shadow regulation because if you're running a platform and there's a lot of fraud going on through it, and you consciously avoid or are willfully blind to that fraud, then a prosecutor could bring a case against you. How do you solve that? You develop a reasonable compliance program. There are Department of Justice memoranda and things like that. So you can say, look, these bad guys got away with it, but it wasn't because we didn't try. Here's all the things we do for detection. You were talking earlier, increasingly you're focused on proactive identity verification and things. Here are things that we do for that. Here's governance. Here's the involvement of the board. Here's reporting. We're doing our best. We're good Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of approach is what I call like a shadow regulation. Also, people's banks. If you're a distro or something, you have a bank. The bank is not going to want to process your transactions, or maybe it's a payment processor that themselves has a bank. But banks are always back there somewhere, and they're heavily regulated, and the regulators are asking them if they've addressed all their fraud risk and things like that. So, platforms have exposure in financial services. We saw this, like MoneyGram is a big sorry to pick on them, but you can read the history of them with DOJ, but they're a big like Western Union type of money services business, money transmitter. They had problems not because they're fraudsters, but just because fraudsters used them and they didn't realize what was happening, and they actually got prosecuted for it. Sorry,
I
go ahead,
just want
Steve.
to point out so a couple of things. Number one, Matt Wolf commented a great tool is World Compliance. World Compliance is a very reputable tool. You can actually also direct API into a lot of those government entities. If you contact them, they will actually give you the API instructions. So yes, absolutely. If you're interested in having your databases, your payments database, whatever, screened under anti-money laundering regulation, please, by all means, contact the regulators or reach out to myself or Steve, and we can absolutely advise you of which ones to reach out to. And then Glenn Friedman asks, shouldn't we combat the fraud being done on an international level? Yes. So there's none of the organizations that I referenced are actually just fighting fraud concentrated only on a national level. The organizations that I referenced are actually all looking to expand on an international level. So I think that that's kind of what you're getting at, but correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free, Glenn. So
Good product placement there. But I would say, I mean, this is going to sound like a selfish lawyer point, but it's actually hopefully good advice. Before you walk into the U.S. Attorney's Office or the FBI and say there's all this fraud going on that we're trying to stop, which could be the right thing to do, sometimes it is good to talk to a lawyer, because there's a lot of different ways to handle those conversations, and there are, candidly, some risks about having them because the old saying, "No good deed goes unpunished." You have to be careful in some situations. But I do think it's interesting, talking about the unregulated question, you know, uh, talking about the unregulated question, there's a lot of money movement that happens in the music industry ecosystem that could not happen in an unregulated fashion outside of it. And what I mean is a lot of companies are, if you set up a business and say, I'm engaging in the business of receiving money from one person and sending it to someone else, like Venmo does, for example, or Zelle or something like that. And you have an app that does that. You have to be regulated as a money services business and things of that nature. There's federal and state regulation of that, but in a lot of, because of the way that the MMA, Music Modernization Act, money flows work and things like that, there's not actually as many regulated touch points when money moves and when there's authority to move money in the music industry. And so there's no direct requirement to report suspicious activity, which you would have if you were Venmo or something like that. But if you're a distro or something like that, and you're acting on behalf of a rights owner, or you are helping somebody get promoted and get on, or you're a label and you are a rights owner, those kind of areas involve a lot of money movement in this, and it's getting to be really big money. Like you were mentioning, that there are estimates that the fraud alone is over, it's hundreds of billions of dollars in music, but the fraud alone is over $1 billion. A lot of people have credibly estimated. Sorry.
It appears that the group that's going to be best positioned to mitigate their fraud risk, at least on the streaming side, is a business that has transparency into both sides of their platform, the creation inventory side and the consumption side, and then can map those things together on an ongoing basis. That's kind of what we're seeing at this rate with identity verification and then ongoing monitoring, as well as building in investigations, audit, reporting, and constantly going through that risk assessment program within your business model to understand where your holes are.
Right. What do you think that the music industry, as you talk to people who are, there's a lot of effort in fighting fraud, and there's even more talk. What do you think that the industry should do better? Where do you think it's going, and what do you think will prompt progress?
Again, it's understanding the actual relationships that your business is having the way other more traditionally regulated businesses do, taking a more principles prescriptive approach, not turning a blind eye, not necessarily constantly reducing the level of entry either on your creator side or on your consumption side, not necessarily trusting who you're doing business with. And that's on, hey, if I'm taking identities and I'm taking and I'm making payouts, or if it's my role in the ecosystem to sell tickets, and I'm trying to buy tickets, not necessarily trusting, hey, the person on the other side isn't selling me a speculative ticket per se. It's understanding throughout the entire ecosystem what your role is within the ecosystem, understanding how people are trying to take advantage of your role, your trusted role in that position, in this very high end, very, lax environment today. And constantly assessing, hey, what are my risks today? Not what were my risks 10 years ago. What are my risks now?
And how do you get that to get updated quickly, and uh, how do you scale that?
So, number one is building in the machine learning now. Starting off with strong platform of microservices, and if that takes microservices that are tied to third-party APIs so that you're not dealing with latency issues, you're not dealing with cost issues. If it means, you're buying a system to tie into your main platform as opposed to building it, because you can't necessarily stay up to date with, the necessary scraping or whatnot. Hey, that's what it means. But it means putting in the necessary efforts, putting in the budget, and getting the buy-in so that you can get the appropriate transparency into knowing your business. At that point, can you begin to see other benefits, like I was explaining earlier, building this into potentially a personalization and customization model?
Right. I mean, one thing that I've working with regulated entities and regulation for decades, one thing that I've learned is that as expensive as it is to proactively implement something, it's always cheaper than reactively responding to somebody saying you should have done it earlier and you're in trouble and you're paying a fine and you're under scrutiny, and it's always harder. But that's oftentimes a hard argument to make. In other words,
Oh,
a lot of the companies that we're talking about, especially as I mean, the music industry has both centralized and decentralized digitally, right? And there's a lot of small players out there and tech players out there who may need something. They don't have budget to, have consultants look at their data, look at their cybersecurity, handle an implementation, and then once they do implement and the data starts flowing, have resources to look at it. Um, what are you seeing that the industry is sort of waking up to all this discussion and investing?
absolutely. So, as more of us are looking to build fan-centric models, and there's more direct-to-consumer efforts. For instance, you're seeing groups like Universal open up e-commerce channels and retail channels direct to consumer. You're seeing that these efforts to build a very internal fan centric database, and that data becoming the key factor, is the utmost importance to the organization. So if they can use that data to better service their fan base, then they see that as bigger growth. So like we were discussing earlier, imagine going into your meetings and saying, well, look, management, hey, I know I was coming to you for years trying to say to you, we need to implement this because this is going to actually be a control. And yeah, we're just trying to authenticate our user base. Now it's, you know, groups like DistroKid who are building e commerce models. Now all of a sudden, we're authenticating our user data. That user data then becomes potentially a revenue stream, an additional revenue stream for us. And on top of that, we become the most fan centric model in our ecosystem because we can then authentically say, you are the user and this is what you're consuming. So, this is what we should be serving you as ads. This is what we should serve you for personalization in terms of your listening preferences, as well as your shopping preferences. If you're in the model like a Live Nation Ticketmaster, and sorry to bring them up today, but if you're in their model, you're talking about building a model where you not only have purchasing information of tickets, but potentially you can build a model where someone is walking into a venue after purchasing a ticket and never taking anything out of their pockets without, while they're purchasing merch, while they're purchasing concessions, and while they're getting to their seat.
So that's all really interesting in terms of where the industry is and where you think that it needs to go. What do you think uh how somebody approach this? If somebody is basically like a distributor or a platform for artists, and they have to figure out what to prioritize, what they need to build. For example, let's say there's increasing litigation, right? In some cases, rights owners are bringing litigation, civil litigation, in order to try to reclaim some allegedly misappropriated, proceeds of fraud and things like that. And those can be copyright claims, those can be common law fraud claims, different kinds of claims. With as a lawyer, I see out there litigation and stuff, but that's also waking people up. So if you are um, a a platform that services artists and brings artists into the world of DSPs and royalties and stuff like that, how do you figure out you've got clients that ideally are going to become recipients of payments? They're going to be on the receiving end. Some of those might be businesses, some of those might be individuals, some might be musicians. Um, how do you decide what to build first? Do you start watching their activity? Do you start looking at who they are? Do you start? I mean, just how would you approach? I know you consult with some companies and consult with some organizations. Uh, how do you give advice on that? Look at that question.
So again, like I've been explaining, it's understanding where you sit in the ecosystem and building out these network of identities. Okay. So it with payments and right holders, it's again, it's not who I'm communicating with necessarily. And yes, that individual is a piece of the puzzle because it's understanding not only who you're communicating with, but everyone down the line to ultimate beneficial ownership. Okay. And these aren't new terms. It's not know your customer's customer. It's ultimate beneficial ownership and understanding who exists within that chain between you and that ultimate beneficial owner. At that point, we start to collect identities. And in this case, because we are dealing with a regulated activity of, money service businesses passing on royalties and whatnot, we are going to be collecting government photo front facing identity. And so we would check government ID, we would check tax information, we would potentially verify using a live selfie in these days because of all the AI that exists in developing, fake IDs. And so gathering that live selfie, gathering that ID, gathering that ultimate beneficial ownership, and then building out the web of identities so that we can then assess everyone involved with each individual in that chain and continue to build out webs. So when we see anomalous activity, like what happens in the financial services world, we then connect that activity to other individuals involved and then build out these activity webs so that we understand, okay, here's the network, the target network, and then can potentially identify further activity performed by this network.
Um, I mentioned that that's the kind of thing that you look at when you're consulting and things like that. A lot of folks know you because you've really dealt with all the key players in anti-fraud in the music industry as sort of a central as sort of a central hub at Pandora and Sirius XM. Um, I know that that you did a transition this past summer, and what have you been doing since then?
So I've been working with BeatDAP, helping them build out certain new activity, um, new capabilities that you'll hopefully be seeing announced in the next couple of weeks. And so be on the lookout for that. And then also, working with Michael Luan on occasion, dealing with enforcement and working directly with him, helping him out in whatever he needs, building out, the Music Fights Fraud Alliance. Working also in fine arts, auctions, e-commerce. So if anyone needs anything, by all means, reach out to me, reach out to Tom, reach out to Steve. And, I'm a good first step before you call your lawyer in to understand what your risks may look like.
Although everything that's said to you is not privileged, technically, right?
Yes, correct. Correct.
uh,
Making that very clear.
I just had to point that out. In any event, yeah. So you mentioned arts and antiquities. I know that you did a lot in that space. You did financial services. We talked about defense and aerospace. Um, how do you what is it that makes you feel connected to the music industry or to music? I'm going to be a spoiler here and say that I know that you're a shofar player, but what connects you to music?
I do blow shofar. I used to play very much more than today trombone and drums. Big jazz fan from through my uncles. Big deadhead through my uncle and my aunt. So yeah, that's my connection to the music world. What about yours?
Well, um, in addition to you being kind enough to uh, to introduce me to people who are trying to analyze this, how financial fraud applies in the music world, which I'm grateful for. So thank you. I have been passionate about music, pretty much my whole life. I have played guitar since I was 14 years old, and have added a number of other instruments like piano and bass and obscure things like mandolin and stuff like that along the way. So I'm uh, an avid amateur musician, and I guess that does help me both empathize with and sort of make me concerned about the mission of anti-fraud in this particular space, and I guess that makes it more interesting and more fun to me. But I got to tell you, it's in addition to being a great creative endeavor that and we have a great music industry in the United States. Um, and obviously around the world it's very exciting and stuff like that, but here the business is like its whole world, and it's totally different, and a lot of the again the stuff that we're looking at, financial transactions, operate very differently in the music space. So I find that fascinating. I was involved in financial services when I was counsel to the House of Representatives Banking and Financial Services Committee back in the day. We were dealing with the beginning of internet financial services, online banking, online brokerage, things like that. And what was happening was the traditional model where you have a buyer of goods and services and a seller of goods and services, and there's a buyer's bank and a seller's bank, and the buyer's bank and the seller's bank transact with each other in order to pay for the goods and services, whether that's in traditional international trade or whether it's in like uh, a merchant model for consumers through a network like Visa or MasterCard. It was pretty simple, buyer, seller, and each have their own banks, and the banks do the transaction. The world has gotten much more complicated, and we saw that with the emergence of online banking and stuff first in the late 90s aughts, and then fintech is like a whole separate industry. And what's happened is it's no longer just an entity that that works for the buyer or the seller. There's all these entities in between, and that creates all sorts of problems. It creates exposures for fraud and malfeasance and vulnerabilities. It also creates opportunities. Obviously, creates a lot of innovation and scaling, and that's why financial services are quicker than they used to be, and things like that. But it creates a lot of complexity, and I'm starting to see, and I realize that's happened as music has moved from something that I spin on my turntable to something that I punch up through pulling up my DSP, which itself is connected through a whole web of different entities and royalty payments and things like that. And it's really interesting, and both cases, like the old banking laws, were from like the early 20th century, 19th century, things like that. same thing with music, right? A lot of the laws that got modernized with the Music Modernization Act and the Mechanical Licensing Collective and things like that were from back in the day when there were player pianos and things like that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that's where the word mechanical comes from for that piece of the money. But in any event, as the industry modernizes, watching what has to happen with the regulations and fighting the bad guys to get up to date and catch up with that is something I've always found fascinating. So we had 5 minutes. Do we have any good questions? Let's see here. Any ticket questions ever? Randy is the foremost expert. Okay, that's you. You wrote that. Okay.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Can you guys quantify how much money we're talking about here in just fraud in general in the music industry? And let's just say in 2025, is there a dollar figure?
Andrew Beatty often says, I don't know if he's watching. Shout out to Andrew. He often says
2 billion.
2 billion, but so I discount that by 50% and say 1 billion, and I figure I'm safe. But it doesn't really matter, as you know, Tom, if it's a billion and a half, 2 billion, or 1 billion. It's a big problem.
Then in ticketing, I know I've had discussions actually with Randy Nichols, who I shouted out in the chat. There's a lot of speculative tickets as well as a lot of,
the number he gives is massive. I'm watching the chat.
Sales, yeah. Massive is like an understatement. We've probably figured it's about 2 billion, or more, and that's in the US alone. So yeah, $10 billion a year for scalpers. Yeah.
You said 10?
Yeah, so he's actually the expert. So
that's in the chat, Tom, is the 10.
yeah.
Whoa. Okay.
And again, I'm always conservative on those kind of things. So if it's half of that, it's a big problem.
Okay, so that's overall sales. So figure, yeah, it's probably I'd say probably about 2 to 3 billion in fraud.
There's a senator who said $1 billion here, $1 billion there. You start to get to real money at some point. I think that's.
Well, that's crazy. I had no idea it was that much. Gentlemen, I just want to say thank you for what you're doing. It's kind of wonky stuff, but when you talk about a billion with a B and multiples of billion with a B, it's well worth our attention. I don't understand a lot of it, but I really am glad that we've got people like you who do. And I hope that you will continue to do your work and make the industry a little cleaner and safer for the rest of us out here. To the audience, I promised you'd leave smarter and more enlightened than you arrived. We delivered on that promise big time. You should have gotten continuing legal education credit for this one today. But seriously, folks, thanks for your support. We will see you here next week. And in the meantime, just be really nice to each other and get out and enjoy this beautiful fall weather. Take care, folks.
Thanks for having us, Tom.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Thanks for being here, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.